Hello and welcome to this special podcast. I'm Gary Witter. I'm the former editor-in-chief of PC Gamer. I'm here in San Francisco. And joining me today are two of my personal gaming heroes. Two guys whose games I played growing up. I hope it doesn't age them too much. And wrote about as a games journalist. And I'm now very excited to see and play what they've got coming up next. They both have huge projects currently in the works through Kickstarter. And I'm going to introduce them both. Joining me from Los Angeles is Chris Roberts. Hi, Chris.
Hey, Gary. How you doing?
I'm very well. And, of course, people will know Chris as the creator of Wing Commander and Privateer and Freelancer, really one of the big pioneers in the whole world of space combat, space exploration games. And also joining me from Cambridge in England, David Braben, perhaps the grandfather, godfather, whatever you want to call him, of space combat, space exploration, the co-creator of the original classic Elite from, what, am I right, 83, 84, David?
84, yeah.
Elite first come out.
84.
84?
Yep.
On the BBC Micro, and later on 8-bit and 16-bit systems, and then had a sequel in the form of Frontier Elite 2, and now even that is coming back. This Elite, I got to say, is the number one game of all time that I wanted to see come back. I know you've been working on it a long time, so I'm so excited to see it happening in this way. And I'm very honored to have been asked to come here and kind of bring you two guys together. And basically the point of this podcast is to talk a little bit about the where you two guys are with your projects right now through Kickstarter. And we were just saying before the podcast, I got to say, this is tremendously great of you guys, even though people might imagine that you're both working on big space combat type games. There are some commonalities between the two games, both being funded through Kickstarter. One might imagine that you two guys are rivals, but here you are actually trying to actively help promote and talk about each other's properties. I don't remember when I was a game journalist, developers being this nice. Are we all just getting mellow in our old age? What's going on? Why are you guys actually trying to help each other out? You should beat each other's throats.
We have a common goal. I think that we both love the sort of game that Wing Commander, that Elite represented from, I don't know, whatever it is, 2 decades more ago, 3 decades ago even. And they're the sort of games that I really, really love to play. And ironically, there hasn't been that sort of game for a good 10 years, more than that. And so from a publisher point of view, a publisher doesn't really know how successful such a game is going to be. And that's what both Chris and I are essentially up against.
Chris, that makes a good point. What did happen to the space combat game? Wing Commander was a huge franchise back in the day. Elite is one of the biggest and most successful games of all time. So why did the space combat genre just go away?
Well, I have a theory, but partly it's because there was a shift from PC to console games around about sort of the end of the 90s, the turn of the century. Into the 21st century, and I think what happened is when consoles first came around, people didn't think of Sims being on a console. They thought of sports games, and they thought of platformers, and they thought of car driving simulations and stuff like that. And so when the first round of games were made, those were not the kind of games that were getting greenlit on consoles. And if you remember, even first-person shooters didn't exist on consoles back then. And everyone said, oh, first-person shooter can never work on a console. You don't have a mouse. You can't do all this. And then Infinity Ward fought Activision actively to essentially get Modern Warfare on a console, and now one of the biggest genre on a console is the first-person shooter. And I think that any genre needs a developer, like a lead developer, or someone that's got some clout to be really pushing a particular genre. And in the case of, say, first-person shooters, you had the Bungie guys doing Halo, you had the Infinity Ward guys doing the Call of Duty stuff, and you had id doing the doing their stuff, but and you had people the same on action and platformers and on the consoles, but on the space sim side there wasn't really anyone. And you know what it's like in the film business. Everyone's like, hey, westerns are dead, or sci-fi films are dead, and then Avatar comes along with this $2.7 billion. It's like, no, you need a good one. And so I think there probably hasn't been a good a space sim of the style of an Elite or a Wing Commander over the last 10 years. And so that's one of the reasons why you haven't particularly seen it being a major genre. And I hope what's happening right now is you're seeing a bit of a resurgence, and I hope what David's doing and what I'm doing are going to put it back on the map. Because I think once we finish our games and get them going, they'll have an audience of several million people, and it will be enough that publishers should pay attention.
Yeah, I mean, it
I
also.
that. I know that since the last Elite game many years ago, you've been trying, I think, fairly constantly, at the very least on and off, to try and get the next big version of Elite out there. Did you experience any kind of pushback from traditional publishers about the space combat genre not being in fashion anymore? I mean, what's your journey been like from here to there?
Well, yes, I mean, we've done it as a sort of a background skunkworks of it for quite a time, and it's been very start-stop. But the issue with publishers is publishers very much want to see sort of an approach story-based gaming. They also, when you put the schedule, you have to. A paper design is something that's not very good, and if you want to be able to experiment to get it just right. I mean, if you look at what actually is the game, I think Chris and I are actually making quite different games. I think that's what's important. It's just an element of the setting that's important. It's making them in a science fiction setting. I'm sure you guys both know Gary Penn, but he first described GTA to me as Elite in a City. And it's the kind of freedom that these games give you that I think is also what appeals to me. But if you were to say that to a publisher, they go, "Oh, don't be silly. That's not what we're talking about. It's not the freedom that's important. We want an epic story, and all of that side." And to me, the both games I think are absolutely I want to play, but they're so different. I mean, Star Citizen Elite, Elite Dangerous, where we're going, that it's a bit like if there hadn't been a science fiction film set in space for a very long time, would we see them? I mean, we seem to see in the film world films coming along almost like buses. You wait for ages, and then several come in the same genre all at the same time. And then suddenly you see film companies going, "Oh, we want another one of those. That was great. That sold absolutely huge numbers." And I think really that's what we're doing. We're trying to essentially reclaim something that existed a decade or two ago, and we really believe in it, and that's what we're doing. And I think that's why it's really exciting. That's why people in the games business essentially want to see this happen. That's why I think Kickstarter is fantastic.
Well, and what's interesting, of course, is that everyone these days loves the idea of free-form exploration, what they call sandbox gaming. Elite was doing sandbox before that was even a word.
Well, the irony was that Elite was the sort of game that the publishers at the time really didn't want. And I'm sure this echoes with what Chris said. One of the Ian and I first showed the game in a relatively nearly complete form to Thorn EMI, and they loved this. "Oh, it's a fantastic graphical demo, but what do you mean it takes weeks to play? We want something which will play in about 10 minutes. We want." I mean, they were very obsessed with what we later called the coin drop. They wanted 3 lives, and they wanted it to be snackable. They wanted something where you'd maybe get a 4th life if you crossed a score of 10,000. They were horrified by the idea that you wouldn't have a score, and that cash would go backwards, that you'd spend it. They really didn't like that. And I've got a rejection letter that lists what I would consider to be the key features of the game. They wanted us to get rid of having save positions. You had to be able to play through in 10 minutes, maybe a bit longer if you were really, really good. And they wanted more of a sort of wave-based approach to the game. It would have been a completely different game, and these days it would have disappeared. We fought for that, and eventually did find some like-minded people in a company that I don't see us as a traditional publisher. It was Acornsoft, attached to Acorn, who... they got excited by it as individuals more so than in a corporate manner, and it was such a small organisation it didn't really matter the distinction, and that was how Elite originally got made. But it was very different to what was around at the time.
Well, of course, times obviously have changed since the 80s when we were all first getting started out, and of course back in the day when a lot of the biggest hit games were created just by 1 or 2 people in out of their garage or their spare bedroom. That you could kind of go around the traditional publisher model and just kind of do it on your own. But these days, to make the kind of games on the kind of scale that they've evolved into today, you do need huge teams and millions of dollars. So you've got the choice of either trying to convince a publisher, which seems harder and harder to do these days, or follow this new Kickstarter model. So I want to ask Chris, obviously your Kickstarter has been phenomenally successful, and I think that it's clearly one of the, along with the Double Fine game and a couple of others, has emerged as one of the big standard bearers for just what's possible through Kickstarter financing on a grand scale. Did you gravitate towards Kickstarter immediately as the way to fund and make this game work, or did you consider going the traditional publisher route, or do you just feel like that's just not the way you want to do business anymore?
On this particular, so on Star Citizen, I was not thinking that the traditional publisher route was making a lot of sense, because I don't really see what you get from a traditional publisher in sort of that online PC format. I mean, if you take a look at some of the biggest successes on the PC in that world, I mean, it's League of Legends with Riot, and it's World of Tanks with Wargaming.net, and neither one of those guys, well, Riot was nobody; they weren't a publisher at all, and Wargaming.net were this tiny little publisher based in the Ukraine that like no one had really heard of. So I don't think whether EA's behind you or not or Activision was behind you was making a massive difference. As long as you have a great game, I think there's a sort of democracy that happens out in the PC world, especially online, that I don't think you're getting a benefit of what you get with a big box publisher. I mean, a big box publisher gets you into storefronts all around the world. It has sort of the clout for that and can really sort of orchestrate a marketing campaign in those sort of traditional channels. But on the online world, I don't really see it kind of working. I mean, I think the only big publisher that really is successful in that is Activision, and that's really just because they merged with Blizzard, and Blizzard had built that business up. So that was kind of why I went this way. I wasn't ever considering sort of going the traditional publisher route. I mean, if I was doing a Wing Commander and it was a console game, yes, I definitely. I mean, obviously, I would be doing that with Electronic Arts. It's just for Star Citizen, I sort of never felt that it made a lot of sense to go the old-fashioned route.
And David, what was the tipping point for you when you figured out that Kickstarter was the way you were going to try and do this new version of Elite? Was it when you began to see some of these game projects become very successful through Kickstarter, or were you already thinking about an alternative model before even that?
Well, we were already thinking of an alternative model before we saw Star Citizen. The challenges are from the UK. Doing Kickstarter was the first sort of hurdle. There's also sort of timing and availability for that. I mean, when we saw Star Citizen, we obviously watched it with great interest. And the Double Fine project I thought was very interesting. That was where I think we realised that it was a serious proposition. In terms of what Chris is saying, it's for very, very similar logic. I mean, one of the things that we want to do is once the game comes out, we want it to be, for us to be able to be quite reactive, quite live, bringing in new features, improving things. We want the game to very much evolve over time. And in order to do that, it's actually quite hard to do that in a conventional contractual delivery structure where you end up being beholden to things that are no longer the most important things. So you've got to be with or have an arrangement that has that level of flexibility in it. And it's quite hard to create that. And this seems to be an extremely good solution to do it, both in terms of we got direct connection with the fans, and also, a lot of the constraints that come in and get in the way just aren't there, and I think that's fantastic.
So you and Chris have both touched on this now. Obviously, it does sound very appealing, the idea of kind of removing the publishers and the studio and all the people that you might be standing between you and trying to make the game that you want to make. You have a much more direct financial relationship with your audience. Is there a downside to that? You've got a lot, instead of a publisher writing the checks, you've got tens of thousands of stakeholders in this game. Is that a different kind of pressure?
Very much. I mean, it's interesting with Kickstarter that there are a lot of questions come through all the time. People concerned at various different aspects of the game, but actually it gives you a very good feel. And a lot of the questions are actually a lot more sensible than some of the questions that in my time I've seen from publishers. Yes, I think the world is changing at such a rate. It's very interesting to see where this goes, other than the fact it's going in a very good direction as far as I can see.